When I landed in Kyiv airport in 2012, I had a certain amount of apprehension. It was my first trip actually to Eastern Europe. And here I was landing in Ukraine, in Kiev. And as I walked through, conscious of the baggage of Jewish history in that country, as I got to passport control, the woman, the Ukrainian woman who was on passport control, looked at my passport and she said, "Solovey, Ukrainian name. It means the bird who loves to sing. Welcome home, Mr. Solovey." And that was my entry into Ukraine in 2012. And at the time, I was very aware of the irony. First of all, my family actually didn't really come from Ukraine, mostly from Lithuania, my family. But so many of us who are of Ashkenazi descent, which is the majority of this congregation, have ancestry in Ukraine. And so that moment was a very profound moment for me, like the irony of the awareness of history, because a few days later I would be visiting Babi Yar just outside Kiev, where 100,000 Jews were slaughtered by Ukrainian collaborators primarily, and so that the history there. But it was a very profound entry, and actually my experience there was very, very powerful. I wasn't there for very long, but it was very, very powerful. And I just have so many memories. One of the first people we met there was Rabbi Alex Duchovny. Rabbi Alex Duchovny, actually, years before, in the late 90s, I was in rabbinical school. We overlapped for a year at Liabeck College in London. And Rabbi Duchovny, Alex, was raised in Kiev when it was still the Soviet Union. And he had no freedom to study or practice Judaism in any way whatsoever. And he actually trained and was a Ukrainian, an official government-recognized Ukrainian tour guide. And he was our tour guide. He showed us through, with great pride for his own Ukrainian heritage, he showed us through the city of Kiev and taught us the history of Kiev. And then he told his own story about how after the Soviet Union fell, and he was able not only to study Judaism, but to go to London and spend 5 years at Liabeck College, where I was for 2 years, and to become a rabbi. And he is one of quite a few rabbis now in Ukraine. And we met a few of them. We met Rabbi Yaakov Bleich, who is actually the official chief rabbi, and his official title is Chief Rabbi of Kiev and Ukraine. And Alex Duchovny, because no one would listen to him because he's not an Orthodox rabbi, he's a Reform rabbi, the World Union of Progressive Synagogues worked really hard to get him a title too. So he is the Chief Rabbi of Kiev and Ukraine for the progressive communities. And they have communities all over the country. And Rabbi Bleich is the chief rabbi, of course, of the Orthodox community. When I was in Kiev, I went to the Brodsky Synagogue, which is a magnificent and beautiful synagogue. I went to the Kiev Great Choral Synagogue. Later on, when I was south in Ukraine, I went to the restored synagogue from the 1700s of the Baal Shem Tov Synagogue in Mezhibozh. I went to Berdichev, where I saw the synagogue there. I saw many synagogues. Mostly I saw graves, and I saw sites of mass graves. But Berdichev is a city in southern Ukraine that before the war there were 50,000 Jews in that one city. It was the second largest Jewish population in the whole of Eastern Europe. And very, very, very few of them survived. I met one survivor, an old man called Herschel, who was a kid when the collaborators and the Nazis came in, and he had his own stories. But what's been so moving to me, and Francine mentioned Moshe House, and there is this sort of revival of Jewish life in Ukraine right now. But what really struck me is Masorti Olami, which is the world branch of our movement. The conservative movement is connected to Masorti Olami, And the Masorti now in Ukraine has communities in Kiev, in Chernovitsa, in Odessa, and there's also smaller minyanim in Kharkov, in Lvov, and in Berdichev. It blew my mind when I saw that. They have a minyan in Berdichev. Berdichev was the home of Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, who was a spiritual descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, and known as the Kedushat Levi, and actually an ancestor of Sarah Shefman. If you're watching, Sarah, we're honoring your Zaidi, and was a very, very powerful figure. And when we interviewed for the film that we made there, Rabbi Alex Duchovny, he talked about his own family being Rizhnitzer Hasidim, and knowing the stories and the melodies of the Berdicheva Rebbe and of all of these Hasidic Rebbes who'd had such spiritual creativity during that time. But then he, growing up under the former Soviet Union, there were just the stories from generations before him. And now the thought that town that was just such a thriving center of Jewish life, Berdichev, now has a Masorti minyan there, just sort of blew my mind. And that we have there now, as shlichim serving the Masorti community, we have Rabbi Reuven Stamov and his wife Lina Stamov, who is serving as the Noam director. She's in charge of all of the Masorti youth for the whole of Ukraine. And they, of course, live in Kiev, but now they're moving or trying to move the whole Jewish community because Kharkiv, for instance, which is one of the places where there's a community, is only 100 kilometers from the Russian border, so it's very, very at risk. So they are mobilizing. Masorti Olamim is mobilizing Jews from all over the region and trying to get them to their westernmost community, which is Chernovisti, and trying to get all of the Jews out there. I tell these stories because my time in Ukraine was a short visit, but it was a very powerful one. And I was mainly looking into the history of the fervent movement of Hasidism, starting with the Baal Shem Tov and going to both his birthplace in Okup and where he was a rabbi in Mezhebush, and going to Breslov, where his great-grandson, the Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav was, and Uman, where also the synagogue of Uman, where Rabbi Nachman's grave is, and all of these places. And so in my imagination, this decimated community, because we know what happened to some of our own ancestors under the harsh regime, where the Cossacks under Khmelnytsky murdered so many of our people. And then there was the communists, and then it was the Nazis, and then it was the Soviets. And each of those generations of our ancestors were very much persecuted. And now we see what has actually been a very free and democratic country evolving in Ukraine. And within that, people who were not able in any way to practice Jewish life in the former Soviet Union, now like this resurgence. And it's the Masorti movement, it's the Reform movement. Rabbi Alex Duchovny, he's oversees like at least a dozen communities all around Ukraine. There are well over 50,000 Jews in Ukraine now, and the World Jewish Relief has been supporting Jewish communities for over 20 years. There's over 10,000 Jewish seniors who they're helping support. And so it's a context. We see these images. It is like horrific. It's horrific what has happened in this country. It's horrific that the world leaders who somehow held up this awful autocrat who most of us knew the inevitability of this, and just the fact that some people in this country are referring to him as a hero and modeling their own leadership over him. It's so horrific when we see the actual reality of what is going on right now in Ukraine. And so as much as we're thinking of everybody, and of course the images of the children and those terrified children who are experiencing nothing that's been seen in Europe since the Second World War, and the pain and the suffering of that. And among all of the other people, we, as people who are not exclusively but predominantly Ashkenazi Jews who have so much of our own heritage in that region, just can't help thinking about the past and the present and the future and what will happen now to the Jewish communities in the region. some of those synagogues, and some of you I'm sure have been to other places, probably to Prague, maybe to other places throughout Eastern Europe, and seen the synagogues, very different architecture in different places, the simplicity of the wooden synagogues of like the Baal Shem Tov, the magnificent buildings that we see in places like Budapest, and some of the great synagogues of Eastern Europe, like the Brodsky Synagogue in Kiev, which still has an active minyan every day, and that's where and there's a yeshiva there, and it's where the chief rabbi, what did I say his name was? I'm blanking on his name now. Oh, Bleich, Rabbi Yaakov Bleich. By the way, of course, the two chief rabbis don't talk to each other at all. We interviewed both of them. If anyone, it's on YouTube now. This film that we made it's called A Fire in the Forest. It was tracing the ancestry of the Baal Shem Tov. But we interviewed both chief rabbis, and I don't know if if they're aware that they're in the same movie, but but there's something about going. And I know some of you, I know Jeffrey and Lois have been all over the world and visited synagogues all over. There's something about when you're in these places, in synagogues, not just in Eastern Europe, anywhere, where you just recognize the power of global Jewish community. And so here we are reading, coming towards the end of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and it's all about the beautiful and lavish details of how we create sanctuary, how we create Mishkan, how we create Mikdash, how we create sacred space, how we create space where divinity can dwell, which is what the Mishkan is really all about. And next week, as we end the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and we actually complete the work of the Mishkan, and we read the Haftorah, which is the completion of the work of the temple, because these two are always seen as part of the same idea that the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, was sort of the prototype of that, was the Mishkan in the desert. And we know that since the destruction of the second temple in 70 CE by the Romans, and what we call the diaspora or the galut, where Jews have scattered all over the world, one of the phrases that people use to describe a synagogue is a mikdash ma'at. Mikdash ma'at, a small sanctuary. And so we are, in a sense, in a mikdash ma'at. We create sanctuary. And so when I think of the whole idea of sanctuary and how that word has become so charged politically, because there are so many people all over the world who feel so terribly unsafe. And what does it mean to create sanctuary for people? But when I think of my time in Ukraine, and when I think of being in those sacred spaces, I think of not just going there as a tourist, and I've been to all of the synagogues in Prague, and I've been to synagogues in Berlin, and I've been to synagogues in Kiev and Mezhibozh and Berdichev and Krakow. And when I go into those synagogues, I really, like if there's like in Prague, it's basically a Jewish museum and you have to pay to go into these synagogues. I feel as a Jewish person, I don't want to pay to go into a synagogue and see it as a museum. I want to go into a synagogue and pray there. So when I was in Kiev, I made a point of actually praying in these places. And then you see these beautiful buildings, this Mikdash Ma'at. And so, how can we not think, among all of the devastation and loss and tragedy and fear, the enormous fear and the lack of safety that people are feeling in that region, how can we not think of our own people, both in the past, whose communities have been decimated, but also the vibrancy of that past, thinking of the creativity and the spirituality that came out of that region, from the Baal Shem Tov and the Berdicheva, the Kedushat Levi, Rabbi Nachman, some of the greatest souls in our Jewish life in the last 350 years has come out of Ukraine. And by the way, you go into Ukraine, you go into a traditional Ukrainian restaurant, you think, am I in a Jewish deli? Because we're Ashkenazim, most of us. And so, yes, there's gefilte fish and latkes and borscht. That's what Ukrainians eat, and a lot of potatoes. In all kinds of different forms, and lots of pickles, right? So the name of this parsha, as I said earlier, Vayakel, is about gathering. And there is just such a power to what happens when people gather together. And that power can be negative and violent and destructive and confrontational. And that gathering can be for the highest and holiest of reasons and purposes, right? And so we gather, some of us in person, some of us online, we gather in a Kihila Kedosha, Vayakel. Moshe gathered the people after the trauma of the aftermath of the golden calf. Moshe gathered the people together to say, we can all be in this together, we can all participate, we can all bring something, we can all be artists of this building that we're going to create. And yes, of course, we think about our own future as Bonei Shalom and our own, God willing, our own building and the ways in which every single person must in some way, large or small, participate in how we create that space. But ultimately it's not, and it never will be, about the buildings, because going as a tourist and paying money to go into a synagogue is never going to be the same as actually going into a community and putting on a talit and a tefillin, or just being with a community on Shabbat, however small and decimated that community is. But when we think of the Jews of Ukraine across the community, we think of the Moshe House, we think of Hillel, we think of Masorti movements and those places again. And I'm going to say the names again: Kiev, Chernovitsi, Odessa, Kharkov, Lvov and Berdichev. Just those places alone have Masorti presence. And then there's the Reform communities, the progressive communities, and of course the Orthodox communities and all the work that Chabad is doing. There is this significant Jewish life. And we're not only, of course, thinking of Jewish life, we're thinking of all life and all people who live in fear right now. But as Jewish people who gather in holy space on this holy day of Shabbat, Kila Kedosha, on this day of Kedusha, holy people gathering in holy space on a holy day, we come together with a sense of strength and resolve and comfort and the power of being together, but we also come with open hearts. As I said earlier, the two ways in which the human heart is described in this parsha: Nadivat Lev, being willing and open, and the sense of volunteerism in the heart, and also being Chacham Lev, being wise in the heart. We need heartful wisdom, and we need heartful volunteerism. We need to think about all of our sisters and brothers, Jewish and non-Jewish, in Ukraine right now. And we need also just to think of each other and recognize the power of Kihila, to hope and pray that our Kihila, our gatherings, are for holy and divine purposes and not for destructive and competitive purposes. As Rabbi Sachs says, he says that Moshe and Vayakel, by placing community at the heart of religious life and by giving it a home in space and in time, the synagogue and Shabbat, Moshe was showing the power of community for good, as the episode of the golden calf had shown its power for bad. Jewish spirituality is for the most part profoundly communal. Hence my definition of Jewish faith: the redemption of our solitude. The redemption of our solitude. There are, I'm sure, Jews in Ukraine and people in Ukraine feeling so desperately lonely, and however we might be able to do that, we let them know that we're part of them and they're part of us. And so on this Shabbat Vayakel of holy gathering, may our gatherings all be holy. May we do what we can. If there is anything meaningful, we can certainly support the World Jewish Relief, we can support Masorti Olami, we can support Hillel, or whatever organizations we want to support to get aid and sustenance to the Jewish communities of Ukraine, or however else we might donate. There's probably not much more we can do other than pray and hope that this evil tyrant to name him for what he is, this Pharaoh of our time who has invaded this country and gathered together in this very menacing and violent and oppressive way the whole Russian army to invade this little country. It's not that little, it's pretty huge actually. Oh, what a world, huh? We have our hearts, we have the wisdom and creativity of our hearts, we have the generosity of our hearts, and we have the power of being together. May we see this awful, awful war end, and may we know and see in our lifetimes the vision of the prophets for an end to wars and an end to suffering. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.